The radio tower loomed over the scrubland like a skeletal sentinel, its rusted lattice cutting a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of the late Arizona sky. For Clara Hensley, the tower was both a lifeline and a curse. She'd been working the overnight shift at KZRN, a small AM station in the middle of nowhere, for 3 months now. The job was supposed to be temporary, a stopgap while she figured out her next move after dropping out of college. But the desert had a way of trapping people, and Clara was starting to feel its grip. The station was a squat, cinder block building, its faded sign barely legible under years of sand and sun. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and ozone, the latter from the ancient equipment that hummed and crackled like it was alive. Clara liked the solitude, mostly. The night shift meant long hours alone, spinning old country records and reading listener calls that rarely came. The silence of the desert outside was a strange comfort, broken only by the low drone of the transmitter and the occasional coyote howl. But tonight, as she locked her beat-up hatchback and trudged toward the station's door, something felt off. The air was too still, the stars too sharp, like the world was holding its breath. She flicked on the studio lights, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cluttered desk and the microphone that looked like it belonged in a museum. The control board blinked with its usual array of red and green lights, and Clara settled into the creaky chair, pulling her hoodie tight against the chill that always seemed to linger in the room. She checked the clock, 11:03 p.m. Her shift officially started at 11, but she always arrived early to prep the playlist and check the equipment. The station's signal reached a scattered handful of insomniacs, truckers, and desert hermits, and Clara took a quiet pride in being their late-night companion. Even if they never called AS, she queued up a Johnny Cash record. Her eyes drifted to the window. The glass was thick, streaked with grime, and offered a distorted view of the scrubland beyond. The tower stood about 100 yards away, its red beacon pulsing like a heartbeat. Clara squinted, noticing something odd. At the base of the tower, just beyond the circle of light cast by the station's floodlights, there was a shape. It was too vague to make out, maybe a bush or a piece of debris caught in the wind, but it hadn't been there last night. She leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging the surface, but the shape didn't move. Just a trick of the light, she told herself, turning back to the control board. The first hour passed uneventfully. She played a few songs, read a weather report for a storm that wasn't coming, and sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos. Around midnight, the phone line blinked red. Clara's heart gave a small jump. Calls were rare, especially this late. She adjusted her headset and hit the answer button. KZRN, you're on the air, she said, keeping her voice smooth, professional. There was a long pause, filled with faint static, like the sound of wind over an open line. Then a voice came through, low and raspy, almost a whisper. You see it yet? Clara frowned, glancing at the caller ID. It was blank, which wasn't unusual. The system was old and glitchy. Sorry, see what? She asked, forcing a light tone. You got a request or something? Another pause, longer this time. The static grew sharper, needling her ears. It's out there, the voice said, each word deliberate, like it was being carved into the air. By the tower. Watching. Her stomach tightened. She swiveled to the window, her eyes locking on the base of the tower again. The shape was still there, but it seemed different. Taller, maybe, or closer. The floodlights didn't quite reach it, leaving it shrouded in shadow. Clara swallowed, her mouth dry. Look, if this is a prank, it's not funny, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Who is this? The line went dead. Not a click, not a hang up, just silence, abrupt and heavy. Clara stared at the phone, her pulse ticking up. She tried redialing, but the system didn't register the call, as if it had never happened. She shook her head, muttering under her breath about bored locals, and turned up the radio to drown out the unease creeping up her spine. Patsy Cline's voice filled the studio, mournful and warm, but it did little to ease the chills settling in her bones. At 1:15 a.m., she stepped outside for a quick break, something she did every night to stretch her legs and breathe air that didn't smell like burnt wiring. The desert was cold now, the temperature dropping fast, and her breath puffed out in small clouds. She walked a short loop around the station, her sneakers crunching on the gravel, keeping the tower in her peripheral vision. The shape was still there, unmoving. She stopped, squinting into the darkness. It wasn't a bush or debris, it was too solid, too upright. A person, maybe, but no one in their right mind would be out here at this hour, not in the middle of nowhere. "Hey," she called, her voice echoing across the empty scrubland. "This is private property. You need to leave." The shape didn't budge. Clara's hand drifted to her pocket, where she kept a small canister of pepper spray, a habit from her college days in Tucson. She took a step forward, then another, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The shape seemed to shift, just slightly, like it was turning to face her. Her heart thudded, loud in her ears. She stopped, suddenly aware of how exposed she was, standing alone in the open desert. The station's floodlights felt miles away. She backed up, keeping her eyes on the shape until she reached the station door. Inside, she locked it behind her, her hands shaking slightly as she double-checked the bolt. The studio felt smaller. Now, the walls pressing in. She sat back at the desk, forcing herself to focus on the playlist, but her eyes kept darting to the window. The shape hadn't moved, but it felt closer, somehow, like it was pressing against the edge of the light by 2 a.m. The unease had turned into a gnawing dread. Clara tried to distract herself by reorganizing the station's logbook, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. The phone rang again, the red light blinking like an accusation. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the answer button. Against her better judgment, she picked up. "KZRN," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The same raspy voice answered, closer now, like it was speaking directly into her ear. "It's not alone," it said. "They're all watching." The line went dead again. Clara ripped off the headset, her breath coming in short gasps. She stood, pacing the small studio, her eyes locked on the window. The shape was gone. She pressed her face to the glass, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing, just the tower, the scrubland, and the endless night. But as she turned away, something caught her eye in the reflection of the glass. A faint outline, just behind her, inside the studio. She spun around, her flashlight raised, but the room was empty. The lights flickered, just for a second, and the transmitter let out a low, guttural hum that wasn't normal. Clara's mouth went dry. She grabbed her phone, intending to call her boss, but the screen showed no signal. Impossible, given the tower strength. The radio, still playing, cut to static, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room like a swarm of insects. And then, from the speakers, came the voice. Not from the phone, but from the radio itself, bleeding through the static. "Look outside," it whispered. "They're waiting." Clara's eyes snapped to the window. The floodlights were dimming, one by one, until only the tower's red beacon remained, pulsing like a warning. And in the darkness beyond, she saw them, dozens of shapes, tall and thin, standing just outside the circle of light, their outlines barely visible. They weren't moving, weren't speaking, just watching. Her scream caught in her throat as the radio went silent, and the station plunged into darkness. The darkness in the studio was absolute, a suffocating void that swallowed every sound except the frantic thud of Clara's heartbeat. The power outage had killed the lights, the control board, and the hum of the transmitter, leaving only the red beacon of the radio tower pulsing outside like a distant, unblinking eye. Clara stood frozen, her back pressed against the desk, the flashlight in her hand trembling as its beam cut wildly across the room. The shapes outside, those tall, silent figures, hadn't moved, but their presence pressed against her like a physical weight, as if the air itself had thickened with their intent. She forced herself to breathe, short and shallow, her mind racing for a plan. The station's backup generator was in the utility shed, 50 yards from the building, past the tower and the figures. The thought of stepping outside made her stomach lurch, but staying here, trapped in the dark with no way to call for help, wasn't an option. Her phone was still dead, no signal, no bars, just a blank screen mocking her isolation. The radio, too, had fallen silent after that voice, that horrible whisper, had slithered through the speakers. They're waiting. Clara gripped the pepper spray in her pocket, its small canister a flimsy reassurance against whatever was out there. She edged toward the window, keeping low, and peered through the grime-streaked glass. The floodlights were still out, but the tower's beacon cast a faint, bloody glow across the scrubland. The figures were clearer now, their outlines sharper in the dim light. There were at least a dozen, maybe more, standing in a loose semicircle, just beyond the station's perimeter. They were tall, unnaturally so, their limbs elongated and thin, like shadows stretched over uneven ground. Their heads were bowed, faces hidden in darkness, but Clara could feel their attention, a collective gaze that pinned her in place. She ducked down, her breath hitching. "Think, Clara," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. The station had a landline in the back office, separate from the studio's phone system. If she could reach it, she might get a call out to the sheriff's department, though the nearest station was 30 miles away in the sleepy town of Red Rock. She didn't know if the figures would let her get that far, but she had to try. Moving slowly, she crawled across the studio floor, avoiding the windows. The flashlight's beam danced over the cluttered space, stacks of old vinyl records, a chipped coffee mug, a corkboard pinned with faded schedules. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and burned electronics, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of the building settling. Or was it settling? Clara froze, her flashlight trained on the wall. A soft, rhythmic tapping came from the other side, like fingernails on glass, deliberate and slow. Tap, 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 her heart lurched. The sound was coming from the direction of the back door, the one leading to the utility shed. She clicked off the flashlight, plunging herself into darkness again, and held her breath, listening. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum, not mechanical, not natural, but something alive, vibrating through the walls. It was the same sound the transmitter had made before the power cut out, but now it felt closer, intimate, like it was coming from inside her own skull. Clara forced herself to move, crawling toward the back office. The door was ajar, a sliver of moonlight spilling through the crack. She pushed it open, wincing as the hinges groaned, and slipped inside. The office was a cramped, windowless room, stuffed with filing cabinets and a desk buried under papers. The landline sat on a corner table, its cord tangled like a noose. She grabbed the receiver, her hands slick with sweat, and pressed it to her ear. Nothing. No dial tone, no static, just a hollow silence that made her skin crawl. "Come on," she muttered, jabbing the buttons. Still nothing. She slammed the receiver down, her frustration boiling over, and that's when she heard it, a faint whisper, not from the phone, but from somewhere in the room. It was wordless, a sibilant hiss that seemed to coil around her, brushing against her ears like a cold breath. She spun around, her flashlight sweeping the corners, but the room was empty. The filing cabinets loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows twisting in the beam's light. The whisper came again, sharper this time, forming a single word, "Clara." She dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the floor. Her name, spoken in that same raspy voice from the radio. She scrambled to pick up the flashlight, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it again. The beam caught something in the corner, just for a second, a flicker of movement, like a shadow sliding across the wall. But when she focused the light, there was nothing there, just the peeling paint and a stack of old logbooks. She backed toward the door, her pulse roaring in her ears. The whisper had come from inside the room. She was sure of it, but there was no one here. No one could be here. The station was locked, the windows too small for anyone to climb through. Her mind raced, grasping for explanations, exhaustion, stress, a prank, but none of them fit. The voice knew her name, and it wasn't human. Not entirely. She stumbled back into the studio, her flashlight sweeping the space. The control board was still dark, the radio silent, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see the figures closer, but they were still there, unmoving, their silhouettes, stark against the desert. And then she saw it, a new shape, smaller, closer, standing just outside the window. It was different from the others, its outline less defined, almost translucent, like a smudge on the glass. Its head was tilted, as if studying her, and though she couldn't see its face, she felt its gaze boring into her. Clara's knees buckled, and she gripped the desk to steady herself. The shape didn't move, but the others began to shift, their heads lifting slowly, synchronized, like puppets on invisible strings. The hum returned, louder now, vibrating through the floor, the walls, her bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a force, pressing against her mind, whispering things she couldn't quite understand. Images flickered in her head, a barren field, a tower not hers but older, its metal twisted and blackened, hands reaching from the ground, clawing at the air, a voice, not hers, screaming into the void. She clapped her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but the hum only grew louder, the whisper sharper. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice cracking. The sound of her own voice snapped her back, grounding her for a moment. She had to get out. The generator was her only chance. If she could restore power, she could get the radio back online, maybe send a distress signal. The station had an emergency broadcast system, a relic from the Cold War days, but it might still work. She grabbed a heavy wrench from the toolbox under the desk, a makeshift weapon, and moved toward the back door. The tapping had stopped, but the hum lingered, a low, constant drone that made her teeth ache. She unlocked the door, her hands trembling, and peered outside. The utility shed was a dark shape in the distance, its outline barely visible against the tower's red glow. The figures were still there, but they hadn't moved closer. Not yet. Clara took a deep breath, clutching the wrench and pepper spray, and stepped outside. The desert air was cold, biting, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint crunch of her sneakers on the gravel. She moved quickly, keeping low, her flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. The tower loomed. Above her, its beacon pulsing faster now, almost frantic. She glanced back at the station, half expecting to see the translucent shape at the window, but the glass was empty. She was halfway to the shed when she heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch, not her own. She froze, her breath catching. The sound came again, closer, from the direction of the tower. She turned slowly, her eyes straining in the dark. One of the figures was moving, its long limbs unfolding as it stepped forward, its head still bowed. It didn't walk so much as glide, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a film reel skipping frames. Clara's mouth went dry, her grip tightening. On the wrench, she backed away, her eyes locked on the figure, but it didn't pursue. Instead, it stopped, its head lifting slowly to reveal a face, or the absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, pale surface, like polished bone, reflecting the tower's red light. Clara's scream died in her throat as the figure raised a hand, pointing not at her, but at the shed. She turned and ran, her legs pumping, the wrench heavy in her hand. The shed was closer now, its door a rusted slab of metal. She reached it, fumbling with the latch, her hands slick with sweat. The hum was louder here, almost deafening, vibrating through the ground like a heartbeat. She glanced back. The figure was gone, but the others were closer, their silhouettes crowding the edge of the tower's light. The shed door swung open, and Clara stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and the generator sat in the corner, a hulking mass of metal and wires. She dropped to her knees, her flashlight shaking as she searched for the manual start. The hum was inside the shed now, inside her head, whispering her name again and again. Clara, Clara, Clara. Each repetition sharper, more insistent. She found the starter, yanked the cord, and the generator sputtered to life, its roar drowning out the hum for a moment. The shed's single bulb flickered on, casting harsh shadows across the walls. Clara exhaled, relief flooding her, but it was short-lived. The bulb flickered again, and in the brief darkness, she saw it, a shape inside the shed, pressed against the far wall, its pale, featureless face turned toward her. The generator died, and the shed plunged back into darkness. The darkness in the utility shed was a living thing, wrapping around Clara like a cold, damp shroud. The generator's brief roar had died, leaving only the echo of her own ragged breathing and the relentless hum that pulsed through the air, the ground, her skull. The shape, the faceless thing, had been there, its pale, smooth head gleaming faintly in the flicker of the bulb before the power cut out again. Clara's flashlight lay on the floor, its beam pointed uselessly at a stack of oil cans, and her hands were frozen, one clutching the wrench, the other the pepper spray, as if either could protect her from whatever this was. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. The hum was louder now, not just a sound but a pressure, a weight that seemed to push against her thoughts, fragmenting them. Clara, 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 it whispered, the voice no longer singular but a chorus, overlapping, each syllable sharp and jagged, like broken glass. She pressed her back against the shed's rusted wall, the metal cold and rough through her hoodie, and tried to focus. The generator. She had to get it running again. Power meant light, meant the radio, meant a chance to call for help. But the shape was still there. She could feel it, even if she couldn't see it, its presence like a splinter in her mind. She forced herself to crouch, inching toward the flashlight, her eyes straining in the dark. The air was thick with the smell of grease and something else, something acrid and wrong, like burnt hair. Her fingers brushed the flashlight's handle, and she snatched it up, swinging the beam toward the corner where the shape had been. Nothing, just the generator, silent and hulking, and a tangle of wires spilling from its side like entrails. But the hum was stronger here, vibrating through the floor, and the whispers were clearer, forming words she could almost understand. Listen, closer, hear us. Clara's stomach churned. She aimed the flashlight at the generator, her hands shaking as she checked the fuel gauge. It was full. She'd checked it last week. The problem wasn't mechanical. Something had killed it. Something deliberate. She yanked the starter cord again. Once, twice, her muscles straining, but the machine only sputtered, a weak cough that died in seconds. The hum swelled, drowning out her curses, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. You can't leave. You're part of it now. Shut up. Clara snapped, her voice raw, echoing in the cramped shed. The words felt futile, like shouting into a void, but they grounded her, reminded her she was still here, still fighting. She stood, sweeping the flashlight around the shed, searching for anything. A fuse, a switch, a miracle. The beam caught something on the wall, a patch of rust that wasn't rust. It was dark, almost black, and it glistened, spreading in thin, vein-like tendrils across the metal. She stepped closer, her breath catching. It wasn't liquid, not exactly. It pulsed, faintly, in time with the hum, like it was alive. She backed away, her foot catching on a loose wire, and stumbled, the wrench clattering to the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence, and the hum stopped, just for a moment, replaced by a new noise, a soft, deliberate scrape, like something dragging itself across the shed's exterior. Clara froze, her flashlight trained on the door. The scrape came again, slower, circling the shed, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the one she'd heard in the studio. Tap, tap, tap. It was methodical, taunting, and it was getting closer. Clara's mind raced. The figures outside, they were moving, closing in. She couldn't stay here, trapped in a metal box with no power, no way out. But the station was no safer, not with the translucent shape she'd seen at the window, not with the voices bleeding through the radio. Her only chance was to make it back to her car, parked on the far side of the station, and drive to Red Rock. 30 miles. She could make it, if she could get past them. She grabbed the wrench, her knuckles white, and moved toward the door, her flashlight shaking in her other hand. The scraping stopped, and the silence was worse, heavy with anticipation. She reached for the latch, her fingers brushing the cold metal, and hesitated. The hum returned, softer now, almost a lullaby, but it carried a new sound, a low, guttural chuckle that made her skin crawl. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, behind her. She turned slowly, her flashlight sweeping the shed. The beam caught the generator, the wires, the pulsing black veins on the wall, and then it landed on the shape. It was closer now, standing in the center of the shed, its featureless face tilted slightly, as if curious. Its body was wrong, too tall, too thin, its limbs bending at angles that didn't make sense, like a marionette with half its strings cut. The flashlight's beam seemed to dim as it touched the thing, as if the light itself was being swallowed. Clara's scream lodged in her throat. She stumbled back, hitting the door, and the shape moved, not walking but shifting, its form blurring as it crossed the shed in an instant. It was inches from her now, its smooth, pale head looming, reflecting the faint red glow of the tower's beacon through the shed's tiny window. The hum was deafening, a chorus of voices screaming her name, and her vision blurred, her thoughts fracturing under the weight of it. She didn't think, she acted. She sprayed the pepper spray, the hiss loud in the confined space, and the shape recoiled, its form flickering like a bad signal. She yanked the door open and ran, the wrench still in her hand, the flashlight bouncing wildly as she sprinted toward the station. The desert air was sharp, slicing her lungs, and the ground was uneven, threatening to trip her with every step. She didn't look back, didn't dare, but she could feel them. The figures, the shapes, their presence heavy in the air, their whispers chasing her through the dark. She reached the station, slamming the door behind her and locking it, her chest heaving. The studio was still dark, the control board dead, but the radio crackled to life, unpowered, impossible. The static was thick, layered with voices, not one but dozens, speaking over each other in a chaotic, overlapping chorus. You can't run. You belong here. Listen, listen. Clara clapped her hands over her ears, but the voices were inside her head now, clawing at her thoughts. She stumbled to the desk, grabbing her keys, her only thought to get to the car, but as she turned toward the front door, she froze. The window was no longer empty. The translucent shape was there, pressed against the glass, its form shimmering like heat haze. It wasn't alone. Behind it, the other figures were closer, their featureless faces catching the tower's red light, their bodies swaying slightly, as if caught in a wind she couldn't feel. The radio's static grew louder, the voices clearer, and one stood out, cutting through the rest. You're part of the signal now. Clara's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, the keys slipping from her hand. The wrench was still clutched in her other fist, but it felt useless, a child's toy against the things outside. The station's walls seemed to pulse, the air vibrating with the hum, and the voices were relentless, weaving a story she didn't want to hear. The tower, it calls, it keeps. You're ours. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling, and moved toward the front door, her only escape. But as she reached for the handle, the radio let out a piercing screech, and the lights flickered back on, weak and flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. In the reflection of the window, she saw it, not just the figures outside, but something behind her, inside the studio, its pale, featureless face inches from her own. She spun around, swinging the wrench, but there was nothing there. The radio went silent, the lights steadied, and the hum faded to a low, constant drone. Clara stood, panting, her eyes darting between the window and the empty studio. The figures outside hadn't moved, but they were closer, their silhouettes filling the glass, their presence suffocating. She had to get to the car. She had to get out, but as she reached for the door, the radio crackled again, and a new sound emerged, a slow, deliberate tapping, not from the walls but from the ceiling, directly above her. The tapping from the ceiling was slow, deliberate, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Clara stood frozen in the flickering light of the studio, her wrench raised, her eyes locked on the cracked plaster above. The sound was too precise, too rhythmic to be random, a message, a warning, or a taunt. The radio's static buzzed faintly behind her, the voices gone but the hum persisting, a low, bone-deep vibration that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Outside, the figures stood motionless, their featureless faces pressed against the grimy window, their silhouettes crowding the glass like mourners at a funeral. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind a tangle of fear and defiance. The car was her only way out, but the keys lay on the floor where she'd dropped them, glinting faintly in the dim light. She edged toward them, keeping one eye on the ceiling, the wrench heavy in her hand. The tapping stopped, replaced by a new sound, a soft, slithering scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the roof. Her stomach lurched. The station was single-story, its roof flat and accessible only by a rusted ladder outside. No one should be up there. No one could be up there. She snatched the keys, her fingers trembling, and backed toward the front door, her flashlight sweeping the room. The shadows seemed to writhe, carrot move, twisting in the flickering light, as if the station itself was alive. The radio crackled, a burst of static that made her jump, but no voices came through, only that relentless hum, now pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She reached the door, her hand on the handle, when the tapping resumed, faster now, directly. Above her, Clara froze, her eyes darting to the ceiling. The sound was erratic, skittering, like footsteps moving in a circle. She imagined the faceless thing from the shed, its unnatural limbs crawling across the roof, its smooth head tilted as it listened for her. Her grip tightened on the wrench, her knuckles white. She couldn't stay here, couldn't wait for whatever was up there to come for her. She had to move. She yanked the door open and stumbled into the desert night, the cold air hitting her like a slap. The tower's red beacon pulsed in the distance, its rhythm faster now, erratic, like a failing heart. The figures were still there, closer than before, their tall, thin forms standing just beyond the station's floodlights, which flickered weakly as if struggling to stay alive. Their featureless faces gleamed faintly, reflecting the red light, and their bodies swayed slightly, a synchronized motion that made Clara's skin crawl. She clutched the keys and ran, her sneakers pounding the gravel, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The car was parked 50 yards away, a dark shape in the moonlight. The hum followed her, louder now, a chorus of whispers weaving through it. Stay, listen, you're ours. She shook her head, trying to block it out, but the voices were inside her, clawing at her thoughts. Her flashlight caught a glimpse of something on the ground, a trail of dark, glistening streaks leading toward the tower. Not blood, not oil, but the same pulsing, vein-like substance she'd seen in the shed, spreading across the desert like a living web. She reached the car, fumbling with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she dropped them. She cursed, dropping to her knees to grab them from the dirt, and that's when she heard it, a low, guttural chuckle, the same one from the shed. It came from behind her, close, too close. She spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping the darkness, and there it was, the translucent shape, its shimmering form standing just a few feet away, its head tilted as if studying her. It was different from the others, less solid, its edges blurring into the night air, but its presence was heavier, more oppressive, like a weight on her chest. Clara scrambled to her feet, the keys clutched in her fist, and aimed the pepper spray. "Get back," she shouted, her voice cracking. The shape didn't move, but the hum grew louder, the whispers sharper. "Clara, you can't, you're part," she sprayed, the mist hissing through the air, but the shape only flickered, its form wavering like a mirage before solidifying again. The other figures began to move, their long limbs unfolding, gliding toward her with that jerky, unnatural motion. She turned and jammed the key into the car door, yanking it open and diving inside. The engine roared to life, and she slammed the door shut, locking it. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the figures as they closed in, their featureless faces gleaming like polished bone. She threw the car into gear and floored it, the tires spinning in the gravel as she sped toward the dirt road leading to Red Rock. The hum followed her, even inside the car, vibrating through the dashboard, the seats, her bones. The radio flickered on, unpowered, the static crackling with voices. "You can't leave, you're the signal." Clara screamed, slamming her hand against the radio, but it wouldn't stop. The voices grew louder, a cacophony of screams and whispers, and the headlights began to flicker, the beam weakening as if the darkness itself was swallowing the light. She glanced in the rearview mirror and stifled a gasp. The figures were behind her, not running but moving, their forms blurring across the desert, keeping pace with the car. The translucent shape was among them, its shimmering outline brighter, more distinct, as if drawing strength from the others. Clara's hands gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, as she pushed the car faster, the speedometer climbing past 80. The dirt road was rough, the car rattling violently, but she didn't care. She had to get away. The radio screeched, a piercing wail that made her ears ring, and the voices spoke as one. "You belong to the tower." The car swerved as Clara's hands jerked, the words cutting through her like a knife. The headlights died, plunging her into darkness, and the engine sputtered, coughing like a dying animal. She pumped the gas pedal, but the car slowed, rolling to a stop in the middle of the desert. The tower's red beacon, the only light in the distance, stuck. Clara's breath came in panic bursts as she tried the ignition again and again. Nothing. The hum was deafening now, a physical force pressing against her skull, and the whispers were a storm, filling her mind with images, a field of twisted, blackened metal. Hands clawing from the earth, a tower, not hers, but older, its signal pulsing through the ground, calling something ancient, something hungry. She grabbed the wrench and flashlight, kicking the door open and stumbling out into the night. The figures were closer, their silhouettes crowding the road, their swaying forms blocking her path back to the station. The translucent shape stood at the front, its head tilted, its presence a suffocating weight. Clara backed away, her flashlight shaking, its beam barely cutting through the darkness. And then she saw it. A faint glow, not from the tower but from the ground beneath her feet. The black, pulsing veins were here, too, spreading across the desert, converging on her car. They moved, slithering like snakes, and wrapped around the tires, the metal groaning as the veins tightened. Clara's heart pounded as she realized the truth. The desert itself was alive, tied to the tower, to the figures, to the signal. She turned to run, but the hum surged, knocking her to her knees. The whispers were a scream now, a single voice, rising above the rest. "You're the key." The translucent shape glided forward, its form flickering, and Clara swung the wrench, her arm shaking. It passed through the shape, the metal meeting no resistance, and the shape let out that guttural chuckle, its featureless face inches from hers. The flashlight fell from her hand, its beam spinning across the ground, illuminating a new horror. The veins were climbing her legs, cold and slick, pulsing in time with the tower's beacon. Clara screamed, clawing at them, but they tightened, pulling her down, the desert itself swallowing her as the figures closed in.